Okay, so today what we're going to focus on is some of the responses to industrialization, what we're going to call the isms that develop as industrialization spreads throughout Europe and beyond. So make sure you guys have your notes with you that you're following along as we go through capitalism, theories on population growth, and the big one that comes out of it is going to be communism. So make sure you guys have that with you. So hopefully by now you guys have seen that for all the benefits that industrialization gives us, it comes with a huge cost. I mean, we talk about working conditions, child labor, conditions in the cities, and it's not all great. So we have some responses that we're going to call the isms. When the Industrial Revolution happened, a lot of both good and bad social and economic issues resulted. And there developed two big ways of looking at this new industrial world. On the one hand, you have Adam Smith, who is a big deal, who founded the idea of capitalism in 1776 with his book On the Wealth of Nations, which becomes a hugely influential book, especially in American history. And he has this idea of laissez-faire economics that he pushes, which says that the government should not regulate the economy. And with this liberalism, we also have a couple other people that we're going to talk about, Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo, and their theories on what's kind of best to run things. On the other side, you have communism and socialism that come up with very, very different ways of thinking about the economy. And these guys really feel strongly that the government has a really important role to try and help the workers and make sure that the businesses weren't focused only on profit, but they also stay in line with terms of, not polluting, paying workers enough money, regulating the classes. So, with the Industrial Revolution, these are the two main philosophies that come out of it, capitalism and communism, that become very, very influential. Whoops, we don't need to go to Thomas Malthus yet. Sorry. Okay, so definition of your isms, and let me see if I can... Okay, so our definition of our isms, how to fix these. The first one's going to be capitalism, which is this economic system that's controlled by private individuals who invest excess money and profits or capital back into their business. The goal here is profit. Capitalism is driven by the desire to make as much profit as you can. With capitalism, make sure that you guys circle or underline that the goal is profits. And that it's controlled by private individuals. That's very distinctive to capitalism. Capitalism, in its truest form, follows a laissez-faire system where the government does not intervene at all in economic affairs. The economy runs by market forces. It does not involve any government intervention. So your main features of capitalism: private ownership of property, motivated by profit, and no government intervention. Reaction to capitalism was the idea of socialism, which says that the economy is going to be controlled by the workers inside the factories, and it's directed not by owners but by a centralized government planning committee. This is going to be your command economy, that the government makes the decisions with the economy. Your goal here is to make the people who do the work more powerful than the owners of the factories. The goal here is to lift the status of the workers. And you can still make more money based on how productive or unproductive you are. Feature of socialism is that you have a lot of government intervention. The government is going to make the major decisions for the economy, what's going to be produced, how much people, what the wages will be, how businesses will be run. And the farthest reaction from capitalism is going to be communism. So with communism, it's Similar to socialism, but it's a step farther. Because the goal of communism is complete equality of condition, not equality of opportunity. So communism, our goal here is going to be complete equality. And communism, like socialism, features no private property, no private ownership of property. You're not focused on making a profit. You're focused on equality of all. So capitalism, private ownership of property, all about that profit. Socialism, government makes most of the decisions. Goal is to make the people who do the work more powerful than the capitalists. And then with communism, your goal is complete equality. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is capitalism. It's really our first economic system that develops from the Industrial Revolution. And capitalism is credited with Adam Smith. He is considered the father of economics. He's the first guy that makes economics a real field of study. And he is the one that comes up with laissez-faire economics, survival of the fittest. He is the guy for capitalism. He is the first one to describe the economic system of capitalism that developed in England in the 1700s. And he describes capitalism in his book On the Wealth of Nations, which later industrialized countries will use to kind of guide their planning. And he very, very strongly believes that government should keep their hands off of the economy. He is totally supportive of laissez-faire economics. He does not like government intervention at all in the economy. And he says that people's pursuit of their own interest would result in the right products being made for the right price. And this is because businesses want to be profitable. So he's really the first guy that comes up with this idea of capitalism, that you should work for towards your own profit, and in that realm it would be best for the economy because businesses are going to want to make a profit, so obviously that would support the economy. What's interesting about capitalism, and if you guys watch the John Green Crash Course video on capitalism and socialism, which I highly recommend that you do, he talks about how with capitalism it changes our culture and it even changes our vocabulary. With capitalism, we have the creation of the word individual, and that becomes very commonplace. You focus on the individual and promoting oneself, and the word career actually comes into play with capitalism, the idea that you might have a career. Before this, if you were talking about careers, it was just like a horse's racing career, their win-loss record. And capitalism puts forth this idea that men and women are not only producers, but they are also consumers, which is going to drive the market forces. That not only do they have a role in producing goods, but also of consuming them, and it's going to advance the economy. Okay, so as the Industrial Revolution's plugging along, we have population increases thanks to our agricultural revolutions, and it leads to a man named Thomas Malthus, who was a clergyman who sees this huge problem looming on the horizon, and that problem is people. We have an overpopulation. So Malthus says that the largest problem facing society is population growth, that it's going to keep, the population will grow to the point that society will no longer be able to sustain itself. So Malthus's theory is that the population growth rate, which you see here in the blue, lighter purple, is going to exceed your means of subsistence, which would be your food production. He says if the population is not controlled, people will die because he did not think that the food supply would increase as quickly as the population. So a lot of people would end up starving, and that they needed to work hard to keep these population levels low. So you see that the food supply increases arithmetically, where it goes, very incrementally up through here. However, your population increases are much more dramatic. So he doesn't see a way for these things to food production to be able to sustain population growth at these rates, which is going to lead to massive starvation. So he's obviously not an optimist. No way is he optimistic. So Malthus says we need to put these checks on population growth. One way or another, population would have to fall. There's no way that it would separate it. You could do positive checks, which would take out people already living, which would be things like war, famine, and disease, which will take care of your current population. Or there are negative checks, which would prevent births from happening. So things like later marriages, celibacy, contraceptions, those would lower the population growth, or at least slow it down. And Malthus wanted to be proactive, and he is all about negative checks, so that fewer people would be born instead of being born and then dying in horrible ways. So in Malthus's view, these poor workers will have babies if there is enough food, but they will not have babies if there is not enough food. So he wants to focus more on the negative checks and preventing or lowering birth rates. He wants to lower the birth rates. So his big theory is that, like I said, the workers will have children if there's food and money to buy the food. They will not have children if they cannot afford to feed the children. And on a related note, there's another guy, David Ricardo, who comes up with the iron law of wages that's very closely related to Malthus. And Ricardo's cycle says that good times are going to lead to high wages. When the times are good, you're going to be making a lot more money. When you have higher wages, you can afford to have more children, so you have a population increase. However, we can't always guarantee that these good times are going to last. Bad times lead to lower wages. The economy is tanking. You're not going to be paid as much. And the lower wages will lead to a population decline. And we have this cycle here that, things are good, you have a population increase, and then you have an oversupply of workers and not enough food, which is going to lead to an oversupply of workers is going to lower the wages. Lower wages leads to population decline, and it's just a big cycle that keeps going and going and going, in Ricardo's mind, which he calls the iron law of wages. Iron meaning that it cannot be broken. There's no way to stop this cycle. So Ricardo believed that the poor people would have babies if their wages were high, and in order to prevent births and overpopulation, you should keep the wages low. So the implications of Malthus and Ricardo's ideas was that your capitalists used low wages to discourage population. The low wages led to suffering among workers. Workers were barely able to eke out a marginal existence. They were barely able to buy the necessary items. They were barely able to feed themselves. So, in this theory, said that trying to help the poor people would only actually hurt them long term. And that comes up with this idea of social Darwinism. And I need you guys to put a star or circle, really emphasize this idea of social Darwinism, because it comes about during the Industrial Revolution, but it's going to shape a lot of European actions, European, American, Western actions over the next couple hundred years. So social Darwinism is this idea that the fittest, so-called fittest people should control the world. It's this idea that natural selection applies to human society, that the smartest and the strongest will survive and we should weed out the weaker ones. However, the problem with this is that human society isn't really a so-called natural setting. Karl Marx, who we're getting ready to shift to, says that we are social animals by nature. It is human nature to collaborate and to share our resources. If you go back to our hunter-gatherer people, it was much more egalitarian, where we had community sharing resources around. You work together to make sure that you have what you need. Capitalism is going to replace this egalitarian society with conflict. So this isn't a natural system after all, and it really leads to, with this, you do not have the strongest really surviving. What you have is people with unnatural advantages. So social Darwinism, the problem here is that human society isn't this natural setting that they think it is. So the strongest don't survive, and you end up with people with unnatural advantages. And these guys, Malthus and Ricardo, and to some extent Adam Smith, think that it's human nature. Competition is human nature. You know, you don't get to the top of the food chain by sharing. However, Karl Marx, Richard Engels, and some of our socialists very strongly believe that we are social animals by nature, and that capitalism replaces, our egalitarian nature with conflict, and it goes completely against our natural state. So Karl Marx is one of the most influential philosophers of the last 300 years. He is in history books, he's in your philosophy text, he's in sociology text, he's in economy or economics text. He has influenced every aspect of the social sciences. He was a journalist and he was a philosopher in the early 1800s. And this quote here is that philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And Karl Marx has memories of his youth, of the French Revolution, and how they created a new society. And that really influences his views. Because he's lived through his experience of the French Revolution and seeing a society completely torn down from its foundation, he thinks that it's very, very possible to create an entirely new society. So Karl Marx sees capitalism as this very flawed system. So he comes up with this new idea of communism, which builds on some of the ideas of our utopian socialist, except he's not quite as elitist as utopian socialists are. Instead, they use this idea of scientific socialism, which Marx and Engels say is rooted in the materialistic theory of history, which is saying basically what matters in history is the production of material goods and the ways that society is organized into producers and exploiters. Karl Marx is a journalist. He is working in France and he's working in England in the early to middle parts of the 1800s. Friedrich Engels is a German citizen whose father owns factories in England, and he visits the factories and see these deplorable working conditions, and they are just shocked, and they say, there's no way this is the right system for us. There's got to be a better way. So in 1848, they published the Communist Manifesto, which is one of the most famous books of the last couple hundred years. I know I've had to read it in history classes, I've had to read it in sociology classes, I've had to read it across the board. It doesn't go away if you pick a major in social sciences. So Marx and Engels are the two that write the Communist Manifesto in 1848. So if you want to make a little note there to put it on your timeline, this is a European event, Communist Manifesto. which presents the ideas of communism in the middle of the 1800s, and we'll see as history unfolds over the next few weeks on how influential this becomes in the 20th century. Okay, so like I said, the ideas of Marx and Engels are outlined in the Communist Manifesto 1848, and they work together to produce this book. It's a sweeping criticism of capitalism and the creation of a new society. It's a very strong reaction against capitalism. So Karl Marx says that history is all about conflict between classes that control the means of production, which would be your owners, and those who do not, who are your wage laborers. So going back to the idea of scientific socialism, what matters is the production of materialistic goods and the ways that society organizes them into producers, which would be Bill Gates here, and exploitees, the workers that are being exploited, which would be this guy with the hillbilly teeth head. So Karl Marx says that society is going to keep control through different reasons. They use government, or the ruling class keeps control over the lower classes through things like government, whether it's the social classes and the hierarchies of, when we talked about French society, Russian society is very rigidly stratified, whether it's religion or just moral values. Marx and Engels will argue that all of these are designed to support the interest of the dominant economic class, that they are designed to control and kind of keep the working man down. There's Karl Marx in all of his bearded glory for you guys. He has one of the most epic beards in history. And his beard, if you've watched the John Green thing, he says that like he's so known for his beard that hardcore communists, hardcore Marxists are called bearded Marxists because it's such a symbol of Karl Marx. And he's very famous for saying that religion is the opiate of the masses, which means that religion is used to drug people's minds and, keep them in line. So he's a very, very cynical dude in that regard. So with communism, they believe that history is progress. Marx believed that human history was all about progress and that society would constantly change and it would get better. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. We're evolving. We started with our slave empires, with Egypt and the Romans, Mesopotamia, the Han Dynasty, and how those evolved and we went into feudalism where we had fractured kind of city-states, almost city-states all throughout Europe, but you had different organization of society, a little bit more egalitarian than our slave empires. And the step after feudalism is once we industrialized, it led us to capitalism. And Karl Marx believed that capitalism was just our next step in our evolution. He did not believe that it was a permanent state. And this is because the Industrial Revolution sets up a new conflict between the owners of the factories, who he calls the bourgeoisie, and the factory workers, who he calls the proletariats. So in society's evolution, it's going to be shaped by this conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And when you talk about the communist revolutions and Marxism, these are the terms that you need to use. Instead of capitalists and workers, it's bourgeoisie and proletariat. It just makes you sound smarter if you say it anyways. Everybody likes big words. So Marx has this idea, Marx and Engels, it's mostly Marx though, has this idea that this increased suffering among the proletariat would inevitably lead them to revolt against the bourgeoisie, owners of these so-called means of production, or the factories. So Marx believes like life is based on two things. It's one of them is that work gives you meaning. He believes that work gives you meaning. Work gives life meaning. Being able to produce things. And what's going to happen is that either your specialization of labor, so when people are subjected to doing meaningless tasks, dull jobs all day, it takes the meaning out of life. You don't have any pride in your work and what you're creating if you're just one small step in it and you never really see the finished product. And then the other thing is that through capitalism, this mass production is going to lead to overproduction and underconsumption because the workers aren't being paid enough to actually consume what they're producing. So if we have underconsumption, it means that basically sales are low. And if sales are low, it means that you have lower profits for the capitalist. If you have lower profits for the capitalist, that means lower wages and unemployment for the workers, which would eventually lead to what would be known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. The end goal of this revolt would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, which means that the workers would be the ones in control and it would end private property. So he has this idea, he's very, very confident. He says basically it's inevitable that as you take away meaning from these people's lives, as you take away their income, and you continually exploit them and just take advantage of them for generations, they will inevitably get sick of it. And these clashes would end in a colossal transformation of human society, that it's basically going to usher in a new world of true liberty, equality, and fraternity. And I hope that sounds familiar to you, the liberty, equality, and fraternity, because it goes back to those ideas from the French Revolution that you would do away with social classes and everyone would be united as, brothers. Everyone would be equal. And that's the end goal of communism, that you establish this equality for everybody. So you can see, his theory, and when you read it and think about it, it definitely makes sense that you have all of these people that are held down, that are exploited, they're working in miserable conditions, monotonous jobs that have no meaning to their life. And you have all these workers versus the one capitalist or bourgeoisie. So his theory is that eventually they'll get fed up with it, they'll unite together and overthrow the bourgeoisie and create this entirely new society based on those similar goals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. So the end goal of communism here is that the workers would create a society without social classes, where no one had any private property and all needs were met. And this goes back to those ideas of communism from that first slide, that the goal of communism is total equality, that you're born equal, you die equal, you can't accumulate private property. The goal here is not profit, and capitalism is all me, gimme, and communism is about sharing the resources equally among all, making sure that everybody's needs are actually met. And Marx's tagline for this is, "From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs," so that everyone has a role to play in here. Everyone, as long as you perform your role for the good of all, then you will be given enough to satisfy your needs. So the Communist Manifesto says the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. And that kind of becomes the the rallying cry of the proletariats as communist revolutions began to take hold in France, in Germany, in Austria, and throughout Europe. Um, and Marx's legacy is powerful. It's still felt today because as we, wrestle with this idea of protecting our collective interest, um, it's a very, very powerful idea today. And we see this to the extent that we use socialist principles to regulate free markets, and how that remains an open question. And this is where Marx still matters. How are we going to use socialist principles to regulate free markets? Do we, as the John Green video says, are we going to provide health care for all? Are we going to provide pensions for the old? Is there going to be, should the government control like the mail business or education or airport security? What aspects of our market do we invite government control in? Um, so even though Marxist ideas are now almost 170 years old, they are still prevalent in our world today, um, as we wrestle with these questions, because capitalism in its truest form cannot exist. It will collapse in on each other, in on itself. And we see this in the early days of the Industrial Revolution with the market cycles. Um, you know, we have to have some sort of welfare check on our population. And on the same token, communism and socialism in its truest form doesn't exist either. It cannot exist in its truest form. So this is questions that societies wrestle with is how do we blend these two? And it looks very, very different in the United States versus how it might look in Sweden or in France or in many European nations, to be honest. So that is going to wrap up our responses to industrialism with our isms. The biggest one that comes out of it is going to be the rise of communism. So I wanted to make sure you guys had a really thorough understanding of how it comes as a reaction from the Industrial Revolution. Make sure you bring these to class with you. As always, if you have any questions, you can ask me on the next time that we meet.